Moses and Akhenaten, the Pharaoh of Egypt, a different history from the one we know, according to claims. What is today called the Christian religion already existed among the ancients and was not lacking in the beginnings of the human race. When Christ appeared in the flesh, the true religion that already existed received the name Christian. This is what St. Augustine wrote, the Bishop of Hippo. Remember that he was a true rake in the sense of the word, and his mother, St. Monica, with her prayers, probably caused his conversion. He became the Bishop of Hippo of northern Africa. Now, the story of Moses, the author and editor of the Holy Scriptures, the first five books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as it's known. In this study, we present the alternative narrative of the events related to Moses, based mainly in the Egyptian high priest and historian Manetho, who lived around 300 BC. Manetho wrote the history of Egypt in Greek at the behest of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. This was, of course, at the time of Alexander the Great, where Egypt and the known land in that area was taken over by the Greeks. Hence, they spoke Greek. Now, according to Genesis chapter 46, Moses' people were a group of families who lived nomadically and had settled in Egypt with their father Jacob or Israel. However, due to their ever-increasing numbers, the Egyptians implemented the plan to control them. Another version of the oppression of the Jews by the Egyptians is that the Jews had joined the Hyksos invaders and had fought against the Egyptians. The Hyksos managed to enslave Egypt for several years until the Egyptians managed to drive them out. However, even after their expulsion, the Hyksos returned for a short time to a part of Egypt to be permanently expelled and dissolved by Thutmose III. That's 1490 to 1436 BC. But the fact that the Jews might have been allies of Hyksos gave Pharaoh the occasion to abolish the rights of all Jews and turn them into slaves. In any case, according to the Bible, the Egyptians first had the Hebrews as slaves, and then a decree was issued that every male child born to the Israelite woman was to be killed, but a couple of Israelites, Amram and Jochebed, parents of Moses, hid their newborn son, Moses that is, so that he would not be executed. Jochebed's mother then placed the infant in a papyrus box and left it in the river Nile. Now we know that Moses was the youngest of 3 children. He had a brother, Aaron, and a sister, Miriam. And then, of course, there was Moses. Now the small box with the babe Moses, I think he was 3 months old when he was put there. The small box with Moses was soon found by the Pharaoh's daughter, who had gone to the Nile to bathe. When she found that there was a babe inside, she decided to adopt it and named the babe Moses, which means saved from the water. Moses grew up in the palace like a prince, and from what I remember by reading the Old Testament, he was not only a prince of Egypt, he was the prince of Ethiopia. Now, Moses grew up in the palace like a prince, knowing the secrets of the Egyptian cults, and was initiated into the wisdom of the Egyptians, entering the shelters of the ancient Egyptian past. According to the Old Testament, at some point he realized his origin and decided to play, because of his position, a leading role in the salvation of the Jewish people. In this way, Moses undertook the freedom of his people to lead them out of Egypt to the Promised Land. Modern historians and researchers do not agree on who was Pharaoh at the time of Moses, was adopted into the royal family, nor on who was ruling at the time of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. However, it seems that Pharaoh Akhenaten played a catalytic role in the history of Moses, and also in the introduction of monotheism, since it is supported by some researchers that the two men coexisted. Before referring to Moses' possible relation with Pharaoh Akhenaten, we should refer to Akhenaten. Amenhotep, later Akhenaten, or Amenophis IV, about 1353 to 1335 BC, son of Amenophis III, was Pharaoh of Egypt. In depictions of the royal family of his father's reign, Akhenaten is not depicted with the rest of the royal family. It's speculated that this may be due to his sickly nature or to his strange presentation, his appearance. His upbringing was entrusted to the priesthood of Ra in Heliopolis and not to the priesthood of Ammon, the traditional protector of the royal house. However, due to the early death of his older brother and thanks to the favor of his mother, Amenophis IV was named heir to the throne in Egypt and was anointed pharaoh in 1379 BC. As soon as Akhenaten ascended the throne of Egypt, he proceeded with an extremely bold religious reform, which causes much opposition from the priesthood of Ammon. He changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Ammon is satisfied, to Akhenaten, he who renders service to Aten, or according to an alternative interpretation, illuminated manifestation of Aten. Queen Nefertiti's wife did the same. So subversive was Akhenaten's religious reform, that unlike all previous pharaohs, Akhenaten saw himself as a prophet and not as the personification of God Horus on earth. He introduced the worship of the sun god Ra as the only supreme creator god. The seat of worship was originally the city of Anu, or as the ancient Greeks called it, Heliopolis, that is, the city of the sun, where Akhenaten grew up. In the 6th year after his ascension to the throne, only he moved the capital from Thebes to the new city he built for this reason, today's Luxor. The city was named Akhenaten, Aten's horizon, and it was named Akhenaten, Aten's horizon, and was exclusively dedicated to Aten, while a new priesthood was charged with the worship of Aten. The archaic Aten was elevated to the god of light, loving father of the created world, and identified with the falcon-headed Ra. According to Egyptian mythology, god Ra was the creator of gods, people, and the world. His emblem was the sun, the symbol of life, light, and fertility. Ra is also depicted with an eye, the eye of Ra, as all-seeing and all-knowing. The figure of Ra was replaced by the symbol of the solar disk. Aten literally means bright disk, the downward rays of which ended in human hands, some of which held the sacred Ankh, the symbol of life. Aten no longer represented only the sun as a solar celestial body, but also the unity of the one life-giving source that sustains creation with its light. The gods were no longer worshipped in the semi-darkness of the shelters of the sanctuaries where only the priests had access, but under the light of the sun, in vast open spaces, open to all the faithful. Worship also of God no longer required the meditation of the large priesthood as formerly, and this was the most revolutionary of all the reforms, provoking the greatest reactions from the priesthood. Because of the reactions to these reforms, in about the 9th year of his reign, Akhenaten ordered the closing of all the temples of the other gods and launched a severe persecution against the priests of Ammon. At the same time, he ordered the deletion of the word gods from all the monuments in the country. During the reign of Akhenaten, we therefore have the establishment of the first monotheistic religion, both in the history of Egypt and in the known ancient world. The great hymn to the son of Akhenaten is typical, quote, "How colorful are your works! They are hidden from the human sight. O unique God, there is none like you. You created the earth according to your desire when you were alone, all men, all animals, great and small, and that stands on its feet upon the earth and runs or soars on its wings. And in the lands of Syria, of Cush, Egypt, and the land of the Aegean," that's Greece, of course, "you placed every man in his place and met his needs. God is one and alone, and there is no other with him. God is one, the one who made all things. God is the eternal is. He is eternal and infinite. He lasts forever and ever. He will be lasting for countless ages and will last for all eternity." End quote. Akhenaten's reign lasted only 17 years. In the last years of his reign, he co-ruled with his son Smenkhare, and after his death he was succeeded by Tutankhamun's son, who ascended the throne at the age of 9. Tutankhamun, who lived only 18 years, did not have the courage to resist the pressures of the weakened but still powerful priesthood of the Amon, so he not only restored his cult but also renounced his father's name, changing it from heretical Tutankhaton, Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, in Orthodox Tutankhamen, Tutankhamon, living image of Amon. So shortly after his death, Akhenaten was labeled cursed. Akhenaten's capital was abandoned, his buildings were destroyed, and his name was erased from all monuments and official records of the state. The worship of Aten continued for a few more years without the support of a powerful priesthood, and the pharaoh was soon forgotten, so that everything returned as it was before Akhenaten in Thebes and the old religion of Amon. But let us return again to Moses. Biblical references cannot help us determine the era in which Moses lived and acted. Therefore, modern researchers rely on historical reports from Manetho, that is the Egyptian priest Josephus, the Christian historians Africanus and Eusebius, and the findings of archaeological finds. This research is based on evidence presented by Gary Greenberg, president of the New York Society of Biblical Archaeology and the member of the American Egypt Research Center, among others. To get a complete view of the findings regarding the chronological identification of faces, the reader should read the research of Gary Greenberg because the data covers a fairly long period of time. In the present study, we'll therefore be satisfied with the most probable version according to the available data. So according to most researchers, the name Moses is of pure Egyptian origin, derived from the Egyptian word emes, meaning born. Moses is a Hellenized rendering of the original Egyptian word. That the name is Egyptian, it would also make sense since the Egyptian princess who adopted and gave this name to the infant, would not have given him a Jewish name, since the Jews were under persecution according to the Bible. So according to the version of the historian Josephus, based on Manetho, Moses was an Egyptian priest named Osarsiph, who organized a rebellion among oppressed Egyptians. After seizing power from Pharaoh, with the help of his Canaanite allies, he imposed a reign of terror on the country, destroying his temples, desecrating his sanctuaries, and plundering the country. Osarsiph, that is Moses, then ruled for 13 years before the exiled Pharaoh raised a new army and chased him and his followers into Canaan. At this point, it should be noted that Moses, or Osarsiph, left Egypt twice, once after Akhenaten died and another recorded as an exodus just before the start of Pharaoh Setu's reign. So according to the findings of Greenberg's research, Akhenaten became pharaoh between 1375 BC and 1372 BC when he was about 12 years old, at which time Moses, or Osarsiph, would also have been a little older than 20. If therefore Moses grew up in the royal palace, he would have had the same royal education. Moses, Osarsiph, was appointed high priest of Ra, placed by Akhenaten to oversee his subversive religious reforms. It stands to reason that with Akhenaten's religious reforms and the establishment of the new capital, a new ruling class numbering thousands of people was created while many more fell out of favor and were therefore hostile to Akhenaten and his priesthood, represented by Moses, Osarsiph. He changed the name Osarsiph to Moses when serving as high priest under Akhenaten, as this was the origin of Osiris's name, which would not have been accepted at the time. In Manetho's account, Osarsiph does just this by choosing MS, that is Moses, as an element of his name, which would preface it with the name of the accepted god of Ra, so the name may have been Ra Moses. In Egyptian, the name would be rendered as Rams without the vowels. Let's remember, even the Greeks didn't have vowels at that time. Now, Rams, RMS. According to Bible, Moses left Egypt because he was sentenced to death as he attacked an Egyptian foreman who had beaten an Israeli laborer to death. And to save himself, Moses fled to the mountains of Sinai, where he lived for 40 years as a herdsman, tending his flocks and purifying his soul. And one day God revealed himself to Moses with the miracle of the burning bush and commanding him to free the children of Israel from captivity. Moses spent 40 years in the desert, which means that he must have been about 40 years old when he left, so his flight must have taken place 1355 BC, a date that separates the reign of Smenkhare and Tutankhamun, who, as mentioned above, put an end to Akhenaten's reforms, bringing earlier religious practices back to the fore. In fact, Moses, as a protagonist in Akhenaten's religious revolution, was forced to flee Egypt to escape persecution. According to Josephus, Moses' political enemies were afraid that Moses would become Pharaoh and therefore conspired to kill him, but Moses was warned and went away secretly to escape. The Pharaoh who is responsible for erasing the last traces of Akhenaten was Horemheb, who was not of royal blood. Egyptian records identify the victims of the persecutions with the followers of Akhenaten, while Wilos with the viruses of Israel. Throughout the country, the remaining temples were destroyed, and all references to Akhenaten's name are erased. A year before Horemheb died, he appointed Ramesses I as his regent. With the death of Horemheb, Moses takes advantage of the vacuum in power and returns to Egypt, aiming to be appointed pharaoh and to restore Akhenaten's monotheism. His allies were the persecuted former supporters of Akhenaten. Among Akhenaten's former supporters were a large number of afflicted and infected by various diseases, the lepers, that is, Egyptians due to the persecutions, opponents of Ramesses I, but also foreign opponents of the Egyptians. So who were these people? In addition to the Hyksos invasion, we know that around this time the Sea People invaded Egypt, who were probably Philistines or Greeks, so maybe Moses allied himself with them. In any case, Moses was the leader of people who resisted the power of the Egyptian gods, and confrontation ended with the exit of Moses and his followers from Egypt, chased for the second time, leaving Moses as a former high priest. He managed to take from the shelters of the Egyptian sanctuaries the sacred objects of the Sept mysteries, among which the Ark, some claim, the Ark of the Covenant. At this point in the Exodus history, the Greek myth of Danaus and Egypt seems to be involved. Perhaps, therefore, the reference to the people of the sea refers to them. Now, the people of Danaus, we know that that's the tribe of Dan. And they went to Greece because something happened about a young woman of the tribe of Dan that was betrothed to someone that she didn't want to marry. So a lot of people from the tribe of Dan left Egypt before the Exodus with Moses and the tribes of Israel, and these people went to Greece, to the area we call today Argolida, meaning the area of Sparta, and that's where the tribe of Dan was. Now, going back to this, at this point, the Exodus story, the Greek myth of Danaus, the Danes, the tribe of Dan, and Egypt seems to be involved. Perhaps, therefore, the reference to the people of the sea refers to them. So, according to Hecataeus, a Greek writer from the 4th century BC, therefore predates Manetho, Egypt suffered from a plague, and the authorities attributed it to the presence of allies alien to the established religion ceremonies, which caused the gods to get angry in order for the Egyptian gods to return, The foreigners were persecuted, says Ecatius, which resulted in the tribe of Dan and Cadmus going to Greece and Moses to Jerusalem. This reference coincides with the events of Akhenaten era, a fact reinforced by the reference that the tribe of Dan, Danaus, left at the same time as Moses. But who was Danaus? According to Greek mythology, Danaus was the ancestor of Perseus, the son of the Egyptian king Belus. His mother was a daughter of Nile Aginoe, and his brother was Egypt. Danaus, Belus gave the kingdom of Libya, while he named Egypt as his successor, and from their marriage to many women, the two brothers had many children. Egypt had 50 sons, Danaus 50 daughters. After their father's death, the siblings fell out over Egypt's expansionist view and the paternal inheritance. Wanting to reconcile, Egypt proposed to Danaus that his sons marry his 50 daughters. Danaus systematically rejected his brother's proposal that his nephews marry his 50 daughters, considered these mixed blood marriages an unholy act. To get rid of his brother's suffocating insistence and to escape the fulfillment of the fatal oracle, which said that he would be murdered by his brother's son, Danaus decided to leave his kingdom and seek refuge in his ancestral cradle, Greece. With the goddess Athena's instructions, he was the first to build the Penticondoro, that's 50-masted ship, a ship with 50 masts. You can imagine how huge that was. The Danaida, the ship was called, and taking his daughters, he set sail for the port of Argos. Argos, of course, that's the area of what we know as Sparta. Okay? This is how the prophecy that Prometheus had given to the ancestors of Danaus was fulfilled. 50 generations after him, Epaphus, a woman with her 50 daughters, will return to Argos against her will, cousin marriage in order to escape, and they, maddened by lust, like hawks, will pounce on doves, chasing marriages that are not compatible. Danaus built in Argos the Acropolis with huge carved boulders, which was named Larissa after the daughter of King Pelasgus. On its top he built a temple in honor of Larissa Zeus, where a wooden effigy of the god was placed. It did not take long, however, for Egypt to be conquered with its 50 sons, and it demanded that incestuous marriages be carried out by force. Danaus pretended to accept, after lots were drawn so that each young man would know which nymph he would marry, which young woman he would marry. The wedding ceremonies followed. But on the night of the wedding, Danaus gave each of his daughters a manual with the command to kill their husbands in their sleep. That is, he gave their daughters the instruction, a command. The Danaides obeyed, the women obeyed and carried out their father's orders, except for two, Rhoda, or Bevrika, wife of Hippolytus, and Hypermnestra, and by the hand of Ligius Danaus finally met his death, and thus the oracle of the Egyptian diviner was verified. It became true that Danaus was killed by one of those sons. Danaus decreed by law that the Argive Pelasgians would henceforth be called Danai, a name which in the Homeric epics includes all the Greeks of mainland and insular Greece, characterizing the Greeks as a whole according to Euripides, Pelasgiotis, named before. The tribe of Dan, the Danaus, are called by law, they became Greece. From the above, it's obvious that history does not have a single reading, even more so when the events that are recounted are thousands of years away from us. The fact, however, that the similarities of the Jewish way of life, but also the events described in the Bible with the pagan practices of the Egyptians, and not only of that time, but also of the monotheistic religions that developed later in Christianity. I have made relevant references to the lost ark of ancient Greek philosophy and the mysteries. The history of the Jews will be repeated in history of repeated enslavement by foreign nations, from the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Syrians, and finally in 63 BC from the Romans. These conquests inevitably led the Jewish people to submit to the cultural influences of their conquerors and forced the Jews to disperse throughout the Mediterranean. For this reason, the Jewish Messiah was expected as a warrior king who would come to liberate Judea from her enemies and restore the line of David. And of course, the line of David was restored by our Lord Jesus Christ. This I've translated for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.